I never thought my life would turn into a courtroom drama, but there I was, sitting across from the woman who had spent years trying to destroy me. Margaret, my mother-in-law, smirked like she had already won. We were at my late husband Daniel's will reading, and she was acting like the main character, like the grieving widow when she was, in fact, the reason Daniel spent most of his life trying to escape her control. I had been married to Daniel for 10 years. We built a beautiful life together. Love, laughter, a home we worked hard for. But there was always one dark cloud looming over us, Margaret. From the moment I met her, she made it crystal clear that she didn't approve of me. She never said it outright. No, that would be too easy. Instead, she was passive-aggressive, dropping little comments here and there. Oh honey, I guess Daniel doesn't mind settling for someone so simple. You're lucky my son is so generous. I just hope you're marrying for the right reasons, because women like you usually aren't sincere. She made it seem like I was a gold digger despite the fact that Daniel and I both worked hard to build our life. In her mind, Daniel would always belong to her. If he had a wife, then that meant he had chosen someone over her. But despite everything, Daniel still loved her. He wanted her approval. He kept trying to earn it, hoping that deep down she'd love him like a real mother should. She never did. And when Daniel got sick, she barely even visited. Then 6 months ago, Daniel passed away. It wasn't sudden. He had been battling an illness and we had time to prepare. And one of the things Daniel made sure to handle was his will. Because Daniel knew exactly what kind of person Margaret was. He knew she would come after me. So there we were, in a room full of lawyers, and Margaret sat across from me, smug. She was dressed in an obnoxiously expensive black dress, like she was at some high society gala instead of her son's will reading. She barely looked at me, but when she did, her expression screamed, "You're done for." The lawyer cleared his throat, shuffling papers. "We are here to go over the final wishes of Daniel Caldwell." Margaret sat up straighter, already bracing for her victory. "To my beloved wife," the lawyer read, "I leave our home, our savings, and all of my personal assets." Margaret's smirk twitched, but she didn't react yet. She still believed that Daniel's money, investments, and stocks were meant for her. Then the lawyer continued, "To my mother, Margaret Caldwell, I leave." He paused, picked up a separate sheet of paper, and his lips twitched as if holding back a smile. "A personal message." Margaret's smirk disappeared. "What?" she snapped, sitting forward. The lawyer slid the paper across the desk. "Daniel left you a letter." I watched as she snatched it up, unfolding it with trembling fingers. Her smug arrogance faded as she read, and by the time she was done, her hands were shaking. Her lips pressed together so hard they turned white. Then suddenly she slammed the letter onto the desk. "This is a joke," she hissed. My heart pounded. "What does it say?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. The lawyer, completely composed, folded his hands. Daniel wanted to make sure his final words to his mother were clear. I reached for the letter. The lawyer handed me a copy, and as I read it, my eyes filled with tears, not of sadness but of pride. Daniel's final message: "Mother, if you are reading this, it means you are probably expecting to take everything from my wife. But I need you to understand something. You have never controlled me, and you will not control her. You spent my entire life trying to manipulate me, making me feel like I was never good enough. But in my final moments, I found peace in knowing that I had built a life with someone who truly loved me, not for my money, not for what I could give her, but for me. You never gave me that love. And because of that, I owe you nothing. Everything I have goes to my wife, the woman who stood by me when you never did." Margaret's breath hitched. She shoved the letter away like it burned her. "This is absurd," she spat. He was sick. He didn't know what he was saying. The lawyer sighed, already expecting this reaction. "I can assure you that your son was of sound mind when he wrote this. And as per his wishes, you have not been left with anything." Margaret's face twisted with rage. She pointed a shaking finger at me. "You did this. You poisoned him against me." I kept my voice calm. "No, Margaret. You did that all by yourself." She stood up so fast that her chair nearly toppled over. "This isn't over," she seethed. "I'll fight this. I'll take you to court. That house should be mine. That money should be mine. The lawyer didn't even flinch. You're welcome to contest the will, but Daniel took extra precautions to ensure that it was ironclad. You'd be wasting your time and your money. I watched as realization hit her. She lost. She turned on her heel and stormed out of the office, slamming the door behind her. I let out a breath I hadn't even realized I was holding. Daniel had stood up to her in the end. Even in death he had protected me. But something in my gut told me this wasn't over. And I was right. Because what happened next was even worse. Margaret stormed out of the lawyer's office, her expensive heels clicking against the floor like gunshots. The door slammed so hard behind her that the books on the lawyer's shelf rattled. I sat there, gripping the arms of my chair so tightly my knuckles turned white. My heart was still racing from what had just happened, from the moment Daniel's letter had been read aloud, from the way her smirk had crumbled into pure fury. I had won. But I knew Margaret wasn't the kind of person who accepted defeat. The lawyer, an older man with a knowing expression, leaned back in his chair. She'll fight this, he said, rubbing his temple. People like her always do. I swallowed hard. She doesn't have a case, right? Not a good one, he admitted. But a bad lawsuit can still make your life hell. As if on cue my phone rang. Margaret. I ignored it. It rang again. And again. On the fifth call I picked up. You think this is over? Her voice was shaking, not with sadness but with rage. You have no idea who you're dealing with. I said nothing. That house, that money, it should have been mine. You were nothing before you married my son, and you'll be nothing again soon. My stomach twisted, but I forced my voice to stay calm. Daniel made his choice, Margaret. You need to accept it. There was a bitter laugh on the other end of the line. We'll see about that. Click. I stared at the screen, something about the way she had said it sending a chill down my spine. But I had no idea just how far she was about to go. The first few days were quiet. Too quiet. Margaret had always been the type to cause an immediate scene when she didn't get her way. The fact that she wasn't doing that now? It terrified me. Then the letters started arriving. Thick, official-looking envelopes with her lawyer's name on them. I sat at my kitchen table, staring at the latest one. I already knew what it would say before I even opened it. Margaret was suing me. She was contesting the will, claiming that Daniel had been manipulated in his final days. That our marriage was fraudulent. That she, as his mother, was his rightful heir. The sheer audacity of it made my blood boil. My lawyer, calm as ever, told me she didn't have a strong case. The will is clear. Daniel made his wishes known. You have nothing to worry about. But I did. Because Margaret didn't care about winning. She cared about making my life miserable. It started with the eviction notice. I woke up one morning, stepped outside, and froze. Taped to my front door was a legal document stating that I had 30 days to vacate the premises. My stomach dropped. I ripped it off the door and scanned it. It claimed that the house, the home Daniel and I had built together, was not legally mine. That somehow it still belonged to Margaret. I felt physically sick. I called my lawyer immediately. He sighed like he had already expected this. She's trying to contest the deed, he explained. She's claiming that Daniel never meant to give you the house, that he was coerced. She's arguing that it should revert to his closest blood relative, her. I gripped my phone tighter. She can't actually do this, right? She can try, he admitted. But she doesn't have a case. She's grasping at straws. That doesn't mean it won't be a fight. And oh, was it a fight? Margaret dragged me into court. She sat on the witness stand, fake tears streaming down her face, claiming that I had isolated Daniel, that I had pressured him into changing his will, that I was just after his money. It was a circus. I sat there, my nails digging into my palms, wanting so badly to scream the truth. That she was the one who had treated Daniel like garbage. That she barely even visited him when he was sick. That he had made his choices because he wanted to be free of her. But I didn't have to. Because the judge saw through her. The case was thrown out. Margaret stormed out of the courthouse, muttering about how this wasn't over. And God help me, she meant it. I barely had time to breathe before the next attack came. A few nights later, I woke up to the sound of my car alarm blaring. I ran outside, my heart pounding, and froze. Someone had smashed my windshield. Shattered glass littered the driveway. A rock lay on the hood of the car. Taped to it was a note. "Get out while you still can." I felt the blood drain from my face. I whipped my head around, scanning the dark street, but there was no one there. Just the quiet hum of the streetlights and the cold, suffocating air of the night. I called the police, but they couldn't do much. "No cameras? No witnesses?" "Not much we can do, ma'am." I hung up, my hands shaking. I knew who had done this. Margaret might not have thrown the rock herself, but she had sent someone. And she wasn't done. Because the next day I got another call. This time from my boss. "I'm really sorry," he said, "but we're letting you go." I gripped the phone tighter. "What? Why?" He hesitated. "We got an anonymous tip that you were involved in fraud. That you were being investigated for manipulating a will." My breath hitched. I was stunned. Speechless. Margaret hadn't just tried to take my home. She had gone after my entire life. And I had had enough. I wasn't going to just sit back and let her destroy me. It was time to fight back. Margaret wasn't just furious, she was obsessed. Losing control over Daniel's estate wasn't something she could accept, and she wasn't about to go quietly. I had barely settled into the idea of finally being free from her when the real war began. It started small, like all manipulative games do. The first sign was the mail. I began receiving strange letters. Some from unknown senders, some with no return address at all. At first I ignored them. But when I finally opened one, I felt a chill run down my spine. It was a fake eviction notice. The letter, typed up to look official, claimed that I had 30 days to vacate the property, citing an unresolved ownership dispute. I knew it was bogus. Daniel had left the house to me. But seeing it in black and white? That brief moment of panic was exactly what Margaret wanted. I called my lawyer immediately. "This is illegal, right?" I asked, gripping my phone. He sighed. "Completely. But she knows that. She's just trying to scare you." And it worked. But that was just the beginning. A week after the eviction notice, my bank account started acting up. Transactions I never made, withdrawals I hadn't approved. It was a nightmare. One day my card declined at the grocery store. When I called my bank, they told me my accounts had been frozen due to suspicious activity. "Margaret." I went to the bank in person, slamming my ID on the counter. "This is fraud," I told them. "I need this fixed now." It took hours, but eventually the fraud department confirmed that someone had attempted to access my accounts using Daniel's old banking information. Information that only one other person besides me would have had access to. Margaret was trying to bankrupt me. The next move came faster than I expected. I woke up to a flurry of missed calls and texts from my employer. My stomach dropped. I had a bad feeling, and when I called back, my fears were confirmed. "Look," my boss started, uncomfortable. "We've been getting complaints." "Complaints?" I asked, my heart pounding. "Someone has been calling the office, claiming you lied on your resume, that you fabricated your credentials." I felt physically ill. "And HR has to investigate," my boss continued. "It's protocol." I wanted to scream. This was exactly the kind of thing Margaret would do. She couldn't take my house, so she was going after everything else. My finances, my reputation, my stability. That night, I sat in my living room, lights dimmed, my hands clenched into fists. I was done being afraid of her. Margaret thought she could bully me into submission. She had no idea who she was dealing with. The next morning, I hired a private investigator. "I need everything on her," I told him. "Every shady deal, every lie, every crime she's covered up. I don't care what it costs, find me something." He nodded. "Give me a week." While I waited, the harassment continued. My trash cans were overturned in the middle of the night. I started seeing strange cars parked near my house, sitting there for hours before driving off. Then came the flowers. A bouquet of dead roses was left on my doorstep. No note. No card. Just rotting petals, a silent message from a woman who refused to let go. I should have been scared. But instead, I felt something else. Rage. I had spent months mourning Daniel, trying to move forward, only to have Margaret trying to erase me from my own life. Enough was enough. A few nights later, I came home late from a meeting with my lawyer. I was exhausted, my mind racing with everything we were planning, but the moment I pulled into my driveway, I knew something was wrong. The porch light was off. The air felt off. I stepped inside cautiously, flipping on the lights, and froze. My house was trashed. Furniture overturned. Photo frames shattered. Papers scattered across the floor. It wasn't a robbery. Nothing valuable was missing. This was a message. I backed out of the house, my hands shaking as I dialed 911. The police arrived quickly, but like I expected, there was no sign of forced entry. She has a key, I told the officers. Do you have any proof she was here? I wanted to scream. Of course I didn't. Margaret was too smart for that. She wasn't some random criminal breaking a window. She had let herself in, done just enough damage to rattle me, and then walked out like she owned the place. I changed every single lock that night, installed security cameras, filed a restraining order. But I knew Margaret. She wasn't going to stop. Then, just when I thought I was reaching my breaking point, my investigator called. I found something, he said, and you're going to want to see this. I met him in his office the next morning, my heart racing. He slid a thick folder across the desk. Your late husband was smart, he said. Smarter than his mother gave him credit for. I opened the folder. Inside were bank records, emails, and, at the very bottom, a hidden will. My breath caught. What am I looking at? He pointed to the documents. Before Daniel wrote his final will, the one that left everything to you, he had drafted an earlier version. One that also cut his mother out but contained something extra. I flipped through the pages, my hands shaking. Daniel hadn't just cut Margaret out of his estate. He had also left instructions for a full financial audit of any joint accounts he had ever shared with his mother. He suspected she was stealing from him, my investigator said. And he was right. I scanned the document, my stomach twisting into knots. There it was, in black and white. Margaret had embezzled thousands of dollars from Daniel over the years. Had funneled money from his accounts into her own, using fake transactions and shady bookkeeping to cover her tracks. And the best part? Daniel had found out before he died. I looked up at the investigator. Does this prove she committed fraud? He nodded. It's more than enough. With a good lawyer, you can not only take her to court, you can have her arrested. I slammed the folder shut. Then let's do it. Margaret had spent months trying to take everything from me. But now, it was my turn. I couldn't believe it. Daniel knew. Before he passed, he knew exactly what kind of monster his mother was. He saw through her lies, her manipulations, and he had planned for this moment. When the investigator laid the documents in front of me, my hands shook. Dozens of hidden transactions, secret withdrawals from Daniel's accounts, shady investments under Margaret's name. This wasn't just about her trying to take what belonged to me, it was proof she had been stealing from her own son for years. The investigator's voice was cold. This is enough to bury her. I took a deep breath and made my decision. If she wanted a war, I was going to end it. First, I sent everything to my lawyer and filed a civil lawsuit. Margaret wasn't just trying to scam me, she had committed financial fraud on a massive scale. This wasn't a petty family dispute anymore, it was a full-blown criminal case waiting to explode. But that wasn't enough. I needed to hit her where it hurt the most, her reputation. So I made sure the press got the story. An article popped up on a well-known news site. Mother tries to steal late son's estate, financial fraud uncovered. It spread like wildfire. Margaret always wanted people to see her as a strong, respected woman. Now, she was nothing but a con artist. The whispers started, the judgmental glances, the former friends cutting ties. She was publicly humiliated, and for the first time in her life, she had no control over it. She lost it. My phone rang over and over until I finally picked up. Her voice shook with rage. Do you have any idea what you've done? I smiled. Oh, Margaret. I'm just protecting Daniel's legacy. Isn't that what you wanted? She screamed, cursed me out, but I stayed calm. My final words before hanging up? You underestimated You underestimated Daniel. And now, you've lost everything. But I knew Margaret wasn't done. 2 weeks later, she was arrested. She had dug her own grave. I walked into the courtroom on the day of her hearing, standing tall, confident. Margaret sat across from me, her once polished appearance shattered. Her hair was messy, her eyes sunken. She used to walk into every room like she owned it, but now she looked like a woman who had already lost. My lawyer stood up, holding a folder. Your Honor, we have new evidence. And then, the moment that changed everything. A video recording. From Daniel himself. The courtroom went silent as the screen lit up, showing Daniel sitting at his desk, pale but determined. If you're watching this, he said, it means my mother is trying to take what isn't hers. My breath hitched. Daniel's voice grew sharper. Margaret, if you are in a courtroom right now, lying through your teeth trying to steal my estate, you need to know something. He leaned forward, eyes burning into the camera. I knew you would do this. Margaret stiffened. The video continued. Daniel laid out everything. Every fraudulent account. Every hidden bank transfer. Every dollar she had stolen. And then, the bombshell. I know about the money, Daniel said. The entire courtroom froze. My lawyer's eyes widened. Wait, what? Daniel continued, his voice unwavering. I know you stole from me. From Dad. From the company. And I know you paid David off. My blood ran cold. Daniel knew. He knew his own best friend had been working with his mother for years. The screen showed bank statements, wire transfers, undeniable proof that Margaret had been funneling money away, using fake accounts, hiding her tracks. And then Daniel smirked. That's why I set a trap. The video cut out. The courtroom sat in absolute silence. My lawyer stood. Your Honor, given this new evidence, we are no longer dealing with just a fraudulent will. We are looking at criminal financial misconduct on a massive scale. Margaret's breath hitched. The judge leaned forward. Mrs. Caldwell, do you have anything to say? Margaret panicked. She jumped out of her chair, shaking her head wildly. I didn't know. This is a mistake. The judge wasn't buying it. Given the overwhelming evidence, I am ordering a full criminal investigation into Mrs. Caldwell's financial history. Margaret's face drained of all color. She tried to speak, but the gavel slammed down. Case closed. And then came the final blow. Margaret was arrested. They froze her accounts. The IRS opened an investigation into her stolen assets. The media dragged her name through the mud. And then the police showed up at her house. That morning, I woke up to the sound of sirens. Margaret was dragged out in handcuffs. Thea, disgraced criminal. And David? That snake tried to run. They caught him at the airport with a one-way ticket to Mexico and $50,000 in cash. Too bad for him, the cops got there first. Margaret's trial was brutal. The prosecution tore her apart. The fraudulent accounts, the stolen inheritance, the bribery, it was all laid out in front of the jury. And the best part? Daniel had made a second video. In this one he was even more ruthless. As the judge watched, as the jury listened, Margaret sat there frozen, forced to listen to her own son expose her as the liar and thief she was. For the first time in her life she had no control. The judge didn't hold back. 15 years in prison for financial fraud. Margaret's hands clenched the table so hard her knuckles turned white. David? 10 years. Margaret tried one last time to reach me. A letter arrived from prison. I almost threw it away, but curiosity got the best of me. It was short. You think you won, but you'll always be nothing without Daniel. You took him from me. I will never forgive you. I stared at it for a long time. Then I did something I knew would haunt her forever. I sent it back. Unopened. Margaret lost everything. Her money. Her home. Her reputation. And me? I thrived. I sold the house she had tried so hard to steal and used the money to start fresh. And the best part? Even from beyond the grave, Daniel won. And that was the greatest revenge of all. Margaret thought she could weasel her way out of this like she had done so many times before. But this time the law was against her. The courtroom was packed on the day of her sentencing, reporters lined up outside, cameras flashing as she walked in. no longer the powerful, untouchable woman she once was, but a disgraced criminal. She wore a plain, ill-fitting suit, her hair dull, her face lined with stress. The weight of her downfall was finally settling in, and it was glorious to watch. David, her accomplice, sat beside her, his usual cocky demeanor gone. He looked like a man who had finally realized he bet on the wrong side. The judge didn't go easy on them. You have manipulated, stolen, and destroyed the trust of those closest to you, the judge said, his tone sharp. Your crimes were not acts of desperation. They were calculated, deliberate, and fueled by nothing but greed. Margaret opened her mouth to protest, but before she could speak, the judge delivered the final blow. 15 years in federal prison for financial fraud, identity theft, and conspiracy. She went pale. Her lips parted, her hands trembling as she gripped the table. Your Honor, please? He slammed the gavel down. This court is adjourned. David's sentencing was next. He tried to cut a plea deal, tried to act like he was just a pawn in Margaret's scheme. The judge wasn't having it. 10 years in prison, he declared, for aiding and abetting financial crimes. David slumped in his chair. His hands curled into fists as he realized that he wasn't walking away from this either. Margaret was escorted out in handcuffs. She turned, one last desperate attempt at holding on to the life she had lost. Her eyes met mine. You did this to me, she seethed. I smirked. No, Margaret. You did this to yourself. She screamed as the guards pulled her away, her voice echoing through the courtroom. I just stood there watching. Satisfied. Margaret always thrived on control. She needed to be at the center of everything. But now, she was just another prisoner in an orange jumpsuit, a number in the system. No influence. No money. No power. The media tore her apart. Every news outlet ran the story. Socialite sentenced to 15 years for stealing from her own son. Her name was ruined. She went from being someone who demanded respect to someone who wasn't even worth remembering. Her so-called friends vanished overnight. The social circles she once controlled wanted nothing to do with her. Meanwhile, I moved on. I sold the house, the one Margaret had fought so hard to steal from me, and used the money to start fresh. A new city, a new life, a new beginning. And then one day a letter arrived. It was from prison. From Margaret. I didn't even have to open it to know what it said. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't regret. It was bitterness. You think you've won. But you will always be nothing without Daniel. I stared at it for a long moment. Then, without a second thought, I threw it into the fire and watched it burn. Margaret was dead to me. And for the first time in my life, I was truly free. Even though Daniel was gone, his final act ensured that his legacy remained intact. Because of him, I didn't lose everything. Because of him, I was able to start over, free from his mother's control. I used the money Margaret had stolen, money that was rightfully Daniel's, to create something meaningful. A foundation in his name. A cause that would actually help people, not just feed the ego of someone like Margaret. And the best part? She knew. I heard through a mutual acquaintance that Margaret was furious when she found out how I used the money, that she had spent her days in prison fuming about how I had taken everything from her. But there was nothing she could do. And that was the best revenge of all. I thought it was over. I had won. Margaret was in prison. David was locked away. I had rebuilt my life from the ashes she tried to burn. But Margaret? She wasn't the type to go down quietly. A few months after her sentencing, I got a call from my lawyer. You're not going to believe this, he sighed. She's trying to appeal. I laughed. A full, deep laugh. Of course she was. Margaret filed every motion she could, grasping at whatever legal straw she had left. She tried to claim she was set up, that she had been manipulated, that she was the real victim. The courts didn't care. One by one, her appeals were denied. Her name wasn't even a headline anymore. No one cared. She wasn't important. That was what destroyed her the most. The day I got confirmation that her final appeal had been rejected, I celebrated. I toasted to Daniel. Because finally, after years of chaos, his mother was nothing more than a footnote in history. Margaret always believed she was too powerful to be erased. But time did exactly that. Her old friends? They moved on. Her social circle? Forgot about her. Even the people who used to fear her? They laughed when her name was brought up. She spent years trying to prove that she was above everyone else, that she would always be in control, that she would never be replaced. And yet here she was, alone, forgotten, powerless, the perfect ending. As for me, I thrived. The house Margaret tried to steal? Gone. I sold it and never looked back. The business Daniel built? It continued without her. The foundation I started in his name? It flourished. And Margaret? She sat in her tiny prison cell, watching the world move on without her. And that was the greatest revenge of all.